Hey there, everybody. This is Queso. This is the Queso You Didn't Know podcast. Joining me, as always, is the beautiful
Roberto Simpson.
man. We got a hell of a story for you today. I know we knocked out the triad, and to end our Asian arc, we're gonna kill it with the Yakuza. And then you got to join us next week where I hand the reins over to Mr. Telberto as he leads us through King Von. But before we break into that dish, we got to finish off this dish. Now, let's set the scene. There's a traditional card game in Japan called Oicho Kabu. It's played with Hanafuda cards, and the mechanics are similar to Baccarat or Blackjack. The goal is to get a score of 9. But let's say you get dealt a hand. First card is an 8, Ya. Second card a 9, Ku. Third, a 3, Z. Add them up. 8 plus 9 plus 3 equals what? 20. And Oicho Kabu, the last digit is your score. So 20 is a 0. It's a losing hand, and it's absolutely worthless. Yakuza. For 300 years, the men who run the Japanese underworld have proudly called themselves the good for nothings, the losers, the societal rejects. It's a name dripping with irony because these losers built an empire that, at its peak, generated billions of dollars a year, owned major corporations, and literally put prime ministers in office. They are the Yakuza, and they are unlike any other criminal organization on earth. The Italian mafia, they hide in the shadows. The Russian mob, they operate behind shell companies. The Yakuza, until very recently, they had office buildings with their logos on the front door. They handed out business cards printed on high quality stock. They had fan magazines you could get at a 7-Eleven. They were open air gangsters. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into the history of the tattooed empire. We are going to uncover their origins in the untouchable caste of feudal Japan. We are going to look at the brutal rituals of finger cutting, yabitsuma, and full body tattoos, irizumi, and why a samurai would chop off his finger to prove a point. We are going to talk about the Black Curtain Fixers who connected the mob to the CIA, the Liberal Democratic Party, and the Lockheed Corporation. And finally, we are going to look at their slow, agonizing death spiral in the 21st century, where the government has finally decided to strangle the necessary evil. This is the story of the men who live in the gray zone between the law and the outlaw.
Well, I guess I'm a prophet of God, or at least I sound like one, because yeah, it gets deeper and darker with every turn. You know, with each progression, quite literally throughout our past three shows, we've just seen a continual progression of people being outlaws, and this really does it. The thing is, it's always interesting before we just dive in because I want to get into it. Just hearing about people who try to portray a certain lifestyle and people who actually do. When Big Meech of BMF, he decided it'd be a good idea to make billboards of him and his group. BMF, the world is ours. That's what it said. And that got the attention of the feds, of course. And we all know how that story ends. And that's not to say that Big Meech didn't have a certain level of prominence, because he obviously did. As far as I know, to this date, he's still the biggest cocaine distributor throughout the United States. But these guys are really doing that. They're handing out business cards, they got entire corporate buildings with their logos out front. There's it's no more bold than that, truthfully.
To be so ingratiated in society, right? That you're not even seen necessarily as a gangster, you're just seen as part of the business sphere of that country.
hmm I mean, truthfully, every gangster's dream, if we're being upfront.
And so I'm sure you're asking yourself, how does one go from being a complete reject to the face of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And to understand the Yakuza, you really do have to look at the people Japanese society threw away. And that's the interesting thing to keep in mind here is that, oddly enough, like with the triads, like with the mafia, every great criminal organization almost always starts from being a castaway. It started in the 1600s, the early 1600s, the Edo period. Japan had been unified under the Tokugawa shogunate. Peace had finally broken out after centuries of civil war. And peace is terrible for warriors. Suddenly, you had thousands of samurai with no lords, no wars, and no income. They were ronin, unemployed killing machines. These men coalesced into gangs known as Kobuki Mono, the crazy ones, or the deviants. They were the original punks. They wore flamboyant women's kimonos, had wild hairstyles, spoke in slang, and carried extra long swords that dragged on the ground. They roamed the streets getting into fights and engaging in a horrific practice called Sijigiri, literally crossroads killing, where they would cut down an innocent passerby just to test the sharpness of their blade. They were ancestors of the Yakuza spirit, rebellion, deviance, the need to shock polite society. But the structure of the modern Yakuza comes from two specific groups that emerged from the margins, the Takiya and the Bakudo. The Takiya, well, those were wandering street merchants. They sold snake oil, cheap goods, and fake antiques at festivals. They were considered the lowest social class because the government ignored them. They organized themselves. They controlled the stalls, they allocated turf, they protected each other from bandits. But here's the twist. In the mid 1700s, the government actually recognized the Takiya bosses. They gave them the right to a surname and the right to carry two swords, privileges usually reserved for samurai, in exchange for keeping order at festivals. This was the beginning of the Yakuza's quasi legal status. They were criminals, but they were useless or useful criminals. The Bakudo, these guys were the true outlaws. They ran illegal dice games on the highways and in the post towns. Gambling was strictly forbidden, so they operated completely underground. The Bakudo gave us the most famous Yakuza traditions. They started the finger cutting ritual, Yaputseme, to punish members who couldn't pay debts, and they started the tattoos. Then there's the Burakumin connection. We have to touch on a very sensitive topic here. A huge percentage of early Yakuza and even modern Yakuza come from the Barukumin caste. They were the untouchables of Japan. People who were forced to work in unclean professions. Butchers, tanners, executioners. They were ostracized, forced to live in segregated villages, and banned from normal society. The Yakuza became a refuge for them. If society won't let you get a job, you join the gang. The Yakuza didn't care about your bloodline, they cared about your loyalty. This created a deep us versus them mentality that persists today.
Yeah, and I like how you pointed that out, how they all start off as outcasts of some sort or underprivileged in some sort. And I guess it's kind of senseless to ask whether or not you think their lashings, a lot of the backlash comes from resentment from this or just anger from their former position because it's quite clear, you know, that aside from other things, you start off as this sort of abandoned class. So, of course, there's a lot of grief built up over since then. But as with everything, there's different rankings and whatnot. There's different calling cards. Like, not to give an off the wall example, but we were just kind of talking about our past days. And speaking of one little hangout session we had back in the day, I remember me and you talking. We were like just kind of kicking it in your room, and it was lots of us. And I was just mentioning how even within our own little group, their own little clique. There's certain subsections, like you had the hardcore stoners, you had the preppy girls type thing, you had the people who were more so kind of out the way or whatever, kind of anime-ish, and they really didn't care for drugs whatsoever. And obviously, with this, there's just different segments that contribute to what causes the Yakuza to be. And I think the third example you gave, it was it's probably the most, I mean, it's definitely the most touchy example, the most touchy topic of the three, it seems.
And I think you raised some really good points, and those were some great observations that you look at any gangster, I think a lot of it does come with a bit of resentment because even if you look at modern gangs, I think you see the same thing that a lot of times it's marginalized people that didn't have a lot of options. And when you rise to a certain status, like you said with the BMF, man, when you get to a certain point, you almost want to throw it in people's faces to be like, you didn't think I was going to be anything, and now I could buy and sell you at the drop of a hat. And I think you see that throughout time that none of our gangs, save for, I guess, if you want to count the mafia, come anywhere near being as ancient as these ones in Japan and China. But the underlying factor is always these were marginalized people that, yeah, I definitely think once you start getting that little bit of money, once you start getting that clout, that legitimacy, yeah, you're going to act a little off the wall because who's going to stop you? And it's finally your chance to flex a little power when you were powerless for so long. And I think that is a good way to look at it. That when you think about the cliques you have as a younger person, you got all these subsections that come together to form a bigger unit. And I think that could be said about any organization, but especially the criminal organizations. That's a very, very good point you raised.
Hmm. And for sure, especially you mentioned the whole Big Meech BMF example. I don't know if you've ever just taken a moment to dive into the show, but if you'd ever just see some of the things they experienced growing up, I'm talking about holes in your jeans, cardboard in your shoes, your brother just ate a bowl of milk. Now you got to share that milk with them. Like just some real struggle life type shit, man. It is just to put it bluntly. And to reach the heights that he did, I mean, you really can't say anything but who wouldn't, especially learning certain things like in England when millionaire first became coined as a term, basically. You had people making lots of money, and that's when lots of money started to flow through that specific area of the world. And people were spending money on ridiculous things, you know. And when it all went dry, lots of people committed suicide and went haywire. So we never really change. It's just truly, it's truly just a repetition. And before we dive off, this is just a perfect time as any to mention this because I thought about how Mansa Musa, you're obviously familiar. I'm sure you know about his pilgrimage to Mecca, you know, and on his way there, he's just passing out gold, like hundreds of $1 million in today's money, literally in
Are you
gold.
talking about when he bankrupted the whole society?
Hmm.
He gave out so much money it became worthless.
Like just handing that shit out. And I can't help but think to myself, and it's pretty good that I am black saying this, but in a truthfully, a lot of black people might look at this as a justification for this specific activity, but really that to me is like a it's like an ancient example of making it rain, you know, truthfully. Like you can hear possibly hear somebody saying something like that. Like we've been doing it. Like and truthfully, I mean, what's the difference between that and just going going throughout town, you know, taking a going throughout the world on a jet, just handing out dollars, just here, take this shit. Say nobody, don't tell nobody who gave it to you. Like, I mean, that is like an ancient example of that.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. Look, you're not wrong. Like you said, even with the gangs and stuff, society just I say it updates. It's the same thing. It just comes in a different package.
You know what I mean? I mean, I guess if anybody ever wants a righteous example to do some ratchet shit, there they go.
Hey, you won't hear any complaints from me. And people that are still listening, here's a little teaser. We do have a BMF episode coming up on our next arc. But I'm sure you're asking yourself now, how does a bunch of peddlers and gamblers become an army? And to do that, you need a code, like any good organization. The Yakuza is based on the Oyaban Kuban structure. Oyaban means father status, Kuban means child status. This isn't a boss employee relationship, it's an adoption. When you join, you perform the Sakazuki ceremony. You drink sake from the same cup as the boss, and that moment you legally, in their eyes, become his son. You owe him absolute, unquestioning obedience. Even if he tells you the crow is white, you say, "Yes, father, the crow is white." And what happens if you mess up? What if you lose the family's money or insult a senior member? You don't just say sorry, you perform yubitsume. You take a small knife and a piece of string, you tie the string tight around the top joint of your pinky finger to stop the blood flow, and then, without anesthesia, you slice it off. This isn't sadistic, it's a practical history from the sword fighting days. In Japanese swordmanship, kendo, the bottom three fingers of your hand are what grip the sword handle tightest. The pinky is crucial for leverage. If you cut off your pinky, your grip is weakened. You become a less effective swordsman. This means you are now more dependent on your boss and your brothers for protection. It was a way of physically binding you to the group. If you mess up again, you take the second joint, then the next finger. In the modern era, it's mostly symbolic and makes it really hard to grip a golf club, but it marks you forever. Then there are the tattoos. Iritsumi. And I mean, come on, everybody that's ever seen anything with the Yakuza. These things are the trademark. These are what catch your eye. And they come with a very interesting history, too. In Edo, Japan, criminals were sometimes tattooed by the government as punishment, a black ring around the arm. The Bakuto looked at that and said, "Fine, you want to mark me, I'll mark myself." They covered their bodies in elaborate, painful art dragons, koi fish, cherry blossoms. These are hand poked tattoos, tabori, which are incredibly painful and take hundreds of hours. I can attest to that, having had one done on my body. Just for funsies. Why do they do it? It's a burning of the bridges. In Japan, tattoos are taboo. If you have a full bodysuit, you can't go to a public bath. You can't get a corporate job. You are declaring to the world, "I have stepped out of your society. I am Yakuza forever."
You know, I always looked at it as sort of a funny way of symbolism with not with this club, but with another club that's kind of sort of a million miles away, but kind of sort of not in terms of them being radical. But the skinheads, basically, the way they work, if somebody has white laces on their boots, that means they haven't spilled any blood yet. Just any other color rather than red. But when they have red laces, that means that they either spilled blood or that they've killed somebody. And I've always looked at that as a sort of an interesting, you know, way of symbolism just to look at a motherfucker's shoelaces and know that they've done something. But for a way of knowing where somebody is at in the organization to be how their hands look, how their fingers look, that is some wild shit. Like if a motherfucker keeps all their fingers, you know that they've been loyal to the organization. You know, that for that to be a way of signage, that what does that say to you? I gotta know that.
It's another level, isn't it? Because I mean, and I'll give the Yakuza this, man. It's a symbol of loyalty like no other. That even in America, we have some hardcore gangsters, but they're not cutting their fingers off for the gang. They might get their ass beaten, they might get killed, but you're not cutting off fingers, man. And the symbolism I love so much. You go past that, you look at tattoos, man, like just period. The spider web on the elbow mean shit. The teardrop tattoos mean shit. I watched this badass documentary. I'll have to send you the link on. It's on YouTube. It's about the prison system in Russia and the tattoo symbolism that they have. Like they'll tattoo stars on their knees when they're top of the food chain, and it symbolizes that you won't bow or kneel to any man. And if you come in with that tattoo and you haven't earned it, they will beat you with an inch of your life, if not kill you.
Damn. Yeah, yeah, man. That's something else. And you talk about how they're not, how, yeah, the gangs out here might be badass to a degree, but they ain't cutting off fingers for the gang. Man, truthfully, when it comes to the killers in the UK, those cats, those are killers with a capital K. The motherfuckers out here, the gangbangers and shit, doing drive-bys or even running up on people, popping pistols, those are killers with a lowercase K. Like for you to go up on a motherfucker, stabbing them, like feel the knife move around in their flesh, scrape their bones, and just see their reactions and stuff, all their fear and emotions, and watch them pass away. And you still have the mental nerve to be a killer after that. Like you really cold blooded. You know what I mean? Like that's some that's some other stuff.
There's this motherfucker from Germany. I'll have to send you some of his YouTube videos. He's a rapper, but also, involved in some shady shit. His name is Jesus, Gezus, I think. And this motherfucker's so badass. Speaks German, nothing but German. Does a whole video where he is in Compton with straight, as you said, lowercase killers, but these motherfuckers are making a whole music video with him. They're not killing him. They're not taking his money. They know he doesn't even speak their language, and yet they are so afraid of this man. They are falling in line and making this video with him. And to me, that speaks volumes, dude.
Before we dive off to the next segment, quite possibly, I remember seeing a stat recently basically describing that Compton, they say it's basically so little, it's always had that reputation for being the whole, basically the quintessential black ghetto city, you know? Like I remember when Bill Maher was being sarcastic and he said that he talked about how people said that George Bush didn't come from a good enough background or whatever. Then he was being sarcastic. He's like, George Bush doesn't come from a good enough background. Like, look at him. I mean, his father's a former president who used to be the head of the CIA. Yeah, this guy's straight out of Compton, huh? Like, it's kind of somewhat of a slur like that. You know what I mean? And at this point, it's so little black people there. It's very, very vast majority Hispanic at this point. But I mean, it was bound to happen. Speaking of the song that I've been listening to a lot lately because I've been on my Tupac wave on To Live and Die in LA. He says it wouldn't be LA without Mexicans. I mean, seems like they would I mean, it would eventually happen possibly, you know.
It all used to be Mexico at one point.
You know. That's I guess a nice change in pace, you know. That'll be the new image of Compton.
It's different. It's different. Now, speaking of new images, you know, we got this image in our head of the Yakuza. But before we get into the modern crimes and the Yakuza we know today, we got to talk about that myth that kept them alive. Why did the Japanese public tolerate these guys for so long? Because of men like Shimizu Jiricho and Kunisada Chuji. Jiricho was a Bakuda boss in the 1800s, but he wasn't seen as a thug, he was a folk hero. He controlled the port of Shimizu. He mediated disputes between farmers. He protected his town from other more violent gangs. He actually helped the government forces during the Restoration, which everyone will recall from our Saigo Takamori episode. He cultivated the image of Ninkyo, chivalry. Sorry if I mispronounced that. That's a hard word to get out. The idea was we help the weak and crush the strong. Think Robin Hood, but with a katana and a gambling empire. The image stuck. For 100 years, the Yakuza told the public we aren't criminals. We are the guardians of tradition. We keep the streets safe from unorganized crime. And weirdly, it was partly true. In Yakuza controlled neighborhoods, street crime, mugging, burglary was often incredibly low. Why? Because the Yakuza didn't want police sirens in their territory. If you mug someone in Yamaguchi Gumi territory, the police wouldn't find you, the Yakuza would. And you wouldn't like what happened next. They created a social contract. The police tolerated the Yakuza as long as they kept the violence internal and didn't hurt civilians, the Katagagi. The Yakuza even acted as disaster relief forces. When the Kobe earthquake hit in 95 and the tsunami in 2011, the Yamaguchi Gumi was on the scene before the government. They used their trucks and helicopters to deliver food and water. Was it a PR stunt? Absolutely. But try telling that to the freezing grandmother who got a hot meal from a guy with 9 fingers. It complicated the narrative.
You know, man, the thing is, you try to stay away from always giving, at least I do, certain examples when we already gave it. Like this, we kind of already covered this, how they're similar to modern gangs, but just the fact that it keeps popping up because it ain't that some shit how even in ancient times you have gangs who quote unquote start off as being organizations for peace. That's quite literally the same shit they say about the Crips. They say about the Black Peace Stones in Chicago, like those were black social organizations and things like that. Even though people sort of overdo it, I feel that they try to make it seem like the Crips are like some sort of branching off of the Black Panthers or some shit. And despite the fact that I'm sure there were lots of early Crip members who were Black Panthers associates and things like that. It's not like they're just a direct shoot off of the Black Panthers, but even in their early existence, they say the same things about them. You know, I'm sure you're familiar with the whole Eddie
Community
Griffin.
response and progress.
Yeah. And yeah, man. It's it definitely says something that that tune always rings along that I think honestly, people honestly, I'm not gonna want to say don't want to, but in a lot of cases, they'd rather not live such, just live such violent and just hard-strung lives, you know, in 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 their origin. they start off as softer figures compared to what they turn into.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And you'll see because the same thing happens here that happens with the Crips and the other gangs, like you're saying, that you start off as this Robin Hood figure, and a lot of people try to romanticize and remember that. But that Robin Hood image always hides a much darker reality. And in this case, it's a darker political reality. In the early 20th century, the Yakuza stopped being just gamblers and became the muscle for the Japanese Empire. They aligned with the ultranationalists, groups like the Dark Ocean Society, Genyosha, and the Black Dragon Society, Kokuryu Yokai, were formed. These weren't just gangs, they were paramilitary organizations. They worked with the Imperial Army. They sent themselves to Korea and China to run spy networks, disrupt economies, and pave the way for invasion. They ran the opium trade and occupied Manchuria to fund the war effort. This is where the state crime nexus was forged. The Yakuza became the shadow arm of the government. They broke labor strikes at home. They assassinated modern politicians who opposed the war. By the time World War II started, the Yakuza were indistinguishable from the fascist machinery of the state. But when the war ended, everything changed.
So, all in all, I guess this can be written off as the case of the neighborhood Robin Hood sort of local figure, quote unquote, selling out, but not even quote unquote, really. I mean, really just selling out and selling their soul. And I had to fight myself not to say the whole Kanye West shit. I can't lie. I know you remember the whole sold my soul to the devil with a crappy deal. It's I got a free toy and some Happy Meals. But really, like that shit. I mean, they really you. It's quite obvious, really, that they looked at this. They looked at these people and they said, "Hey, you seem useful to do such and such, and what are you going to choose? And what do you think lots of people are going to do? You know?"
And they get the legitimacy and they get the money, but and I don't want to be that guy to praise criminals and stuff, but there's something you can appreciate about like with the BMF. You were so big, you were getting billboards, but you were beholden to no one. This kind of hits different because it's like at the end of the day, you're just a crony for the government. So no matter what you make, no matter how much money you have, no matter how legitimate you consider yourself to be, you're just the arm of the government. At least personally.
Hmm. Yeah. And this shows that even in those times, the government and just larger society, institutionalized society that governs what goes on, they always kept an eye on what goes on in the streets and how it can serve them, because it's this guy that I listen to, and he talks about how it's this t-shirt with LeBron James that looks a lot like his DVD, you know. It's for his documentary Hidden Colors or whatever. And he basically talked about how lots of these sports agents or whatever, they're or the people who work for sports agencies, they're paid to go out and see what's hot in black culture or whatever, you know. And so apparently that got back to him that there was a certain DVD out and about, and it looks identical to his DVD cover. And that doesn't change with this either. You always have larger society seeing how they're gonna have pawns to serve them in one way or another.
Oh yeah, yeah. And like you said, the society doesn't change, it just updates. It comes up with different ways to work the system.
Do you think, well, I mean, what does it say all in all, just to play imaginary for a bit, that nobody even thought to themselves to, at least a healthy amount of people never thought to themselves to not follow that guard and to basically to be the antithesis to that, to be the people who wouldn't enforce fascism.
I think it's an interesting question you're asking, and I think really it comes down to, I'd have to say the money, really, man. That if you're a gangster and you're getting the money, you're going to do whatever people ask you, especially if you were someone that came, as we said, from a part of society that was viewed as less than. What do you care if you're hurting the regular person because the regular person wasn't standing up for you? Not to justify it, it's just that would be my thinking that it's kind of along the lines of, well, we're making a paycheck, we're getting good money, and fuck these people, what did they ever do for me? And I think you see that in a lot of these criminal organizations, like we said with the Crips and stuff, and other the Triad, other gangs that came out to be Robin Hoods. That eventually, is it absolute power corrupts absolutely, right?
But even then, just the fact that they completely took over, it just says a lot about society and where people's mentalities are, and really the time. Because the more and more I peer into history, the more I see that they looked at things differently than us on so many levels. And when it came to resources, they basically looked at the resources of the world as being one big pie. And really, if if a certain person got a larger or the largest slice of the pie, then somebody else wouldn't get as much or probably wouldn't get any. There was only so much to go around, basically. They didn't look at society and the economics of society as being something of continual sustaining growth that we look at today. Like there wasn't a capitalist society to lean upon in lots of ways. In so many ways, it's criticized, but I mean, if people just look at if people really appreciate the luxuries of modern life, then they don't hate capitalism, despite how much they, sit up in their comfortable houses and screen record on their laptops about how much they hate it and how much it's done so much harm to them and to society. And of course, there's evil to all. But if capitalism is a religion of some sort, then I think that we can say that it's been a religion that at least it's promised, it's made good on its promises, you know.
Well, and I always argue that altruism isn't free. And what I mean by that is if you're a doctor and you have the potential to come up with a new heart transplant or a new, brain procedure or something, something crazy that nobody's done before, and you have the capability of doing it, are you going to see that through if there isn't a potential $1 million in your future for doing it, you know?
Yeah, and it's like I said, in those days, it was only so many resources to go around. That's how pretty much all of not most societies looked at it. So if they had a chance to get a larger slice of the pie at the expense of someone else, then it was just a special case of that's just what it is in their mind, you know?
And you really do, though. You start to see capitalism merge with what the Yakuza are doing very hard because 1945 rolls around. And spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen Oppenheimer, it doesn't go well for Japan. They're bombed to ashes. Their police force is dismantled by the Americans. They're thrown into chaos. The Yakuza stepped into the vacuum. They ran the black markets, they provided security when the police couldn't, and they grew massive. By the 1960s, there were 184,000 Yakuza members in Japan. That's a staggering number. This is the era of Kuromaku. The Black Curtain, the Fixers. The most famous of them all was Yoshio Kodama. Kodama was a fascist, a spy, and, most importantly, a Yakuza boss. He had been imprisoned by the Americans as a Class A war criminal. But then the Cold War started. The Americans needed someone to fight the communists in Japan, so they let Kodama out. Kodama became the bridge between the Yakuza, the CIA, and the Japanese government. He helped found the Liberal Democratic Party, the party that has ruled Japan for almost all of the post-war period. His power was absolute. In the 1970s, the Lockheed scandal broke. Lockheed, the American aerospace company, wanted to sell fighter jets to Japan. They didn't go to the Prime Minister or the Minister of Defense. They went to Kodama. They paid him $12.6 million in bribes to influence the government. Think about that. An American corporation paid a Yakuza boss to broker a deal for military jets. That is a level of power that we can only imagine, and it's the level of power we're talking about right now. At the same time, the gangs were becoming economic gangsters. They invented Sakaya, corporate extortion. A Yakuza member would buy one share of stock in a company like Toyota or Sony. This gave him the right to attend the shareholder meeting. He would dig up dirt on the CEO, a mistress, a hidden debt. Then he would go there. He'd say, "Pay me, or I will disrupt your company and shame you in front of the investors." Or, "Pay me, and I will silence anyone else who tries to ask questions." Companies paid millions. It became a line item in their budgets. One boss, Susumu Ichishi of the Ingawa Kai, amassed a fortune of $2.3 billion dollars just from these kinds of economic crimes.
Let's just say I see where the I see where the capitalism interlocks in with that, and I'll just say motherfuckers like this, they make Suge Knight look like a neighborhood bully. You know what I mean? Because you think people like Suge Knight are doing some corporate gangster stuff. Because I don't know if you heard, and dude, I don't know how I neglected to mention this to you during our pre-show, but apparently Gucci Man, of course, he was at least he had Pooh Shiesty signed under his label. And recently, Pooh Shiesty, apparently he had Gucci Man robbed. Him and his people, they tied him up and had him at gunpoint and stuff to get him out the contract. It's some old crazy shit. A lot of people looked at that as being like Gucci's moment of like dethroning his gangster, some old crazy shit like that. But you know what I mean? You got moments like that where corporate stuff turns gangster, and you got guys like Suge Knight. Like when Tupac says that people in death row were walking around with guns in their belt who were staff, you know it's basically true. You can pretty much confirm it because they were beating the engineers down for rewinding the tape backwards too far, beating up people for messing up the food order and shit. They had a room specifically for beating people's ass and stuff. You know, you got that, and you got people who are pulling billions, quite literally, from capital crime. It's it's important to know history. I'll say just based on that, not just, of course, to arm yourself with information for various reasons, but just to have a clear perspective, I'll say, on what's really what in the world. Because I don't know, if I was a certain type of guy who never took the time to dive into certain education, I would probably live all my life and die, who knows, 90 years old, thinking that Suge Knight is as good as it gets when it comes to corporate gangsters. And I don't know. I just don't think that that is a life quite well lived.
Especially when you got guys like this. I mean, excellent points all around. And I'll make the comparison that, we covered El Chapo months ago now. And, he was a billionaire, but he had to kill people. He had to build an empire. He had to sell thousands and thousands of kilos of drugs to get there. It's insane when you think about this man had $2.3 billion dollars just digging up dirt on CEOs, going to stockholder meetings and being like, "Yeah, I'll tell your wife about your secret bitch if you don't give me money."
These guys are crazy. And of course, the bombings and whatnot, that leads them into another sort of being spread out into the ashes and having to regroup, after being sort of cast away. So it's another sort of resurgence of grief.
And then everybody is pissed off and angry. As you were saying before, with these guys kind of had a chip on their shoulder because they were cast off when they started back in the 1600s. It's the same thing where your whole country just got bombed to oblivion. You are going to be pissed off and you are going to seek fucking retribution any way you can.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, but they definitely got ground pretty quick because within I don't know, somewhat of a 15 to 20 year period or so, he said there were well over 100,000. So didn't do
180,000,
all,
almost 200. Yeah.
yeah, didn't do too bad. And that just says that there's always going to be a calling for stuff like that when you have disillusion and just sort of chaotic going ons in society, just really loose and unorchestrated things. You know what I mean? There's always going to be power vacuums. And like you said, they stepped into the vacuum.
And then, we talk on this show a lot about the pendulum of morality, that the scales of justice in the universe always tip one way or the other, and you start seeing that scale tip because gravity always wins. In the 1990s, the Japanese economy crashed, the whole bubble burst, and the government decided they couldn't afford the Yakuza anymore. They passed the anti-Boryakudan law in 1992. It designated them as violence groups. It was the first time the state explicitly said you are not chivalrous, you are violent. But the real kill shot came later. In 2011, the government unleashed the nuclear option, the Yakuza exclusion ordinances. They realized they couldn't arrest every gangster, so they decided to starve them. The new laws made it illegal to do any business with a Yakuza member. Not illegal for the Yakuza, illegal for the civilian. If you are a bank, you cannot open an account for a Yakuza. If you're a landlord, you cannot rent an apartment to the Yakuza. If you are a car dealer, you cannot sell a car to the Yakuza. If you are a golf course owner and you let a known Yakuza play around, the police will publish your name, shame you, and you might lose your license. It turned the Yakuza into social untouchables. Suddenly, being a Yakuza wasn't cool. It was a logistical nightmare. You couldn't get a credit card. You couldn't get a cell phone plan. You couldn't even sign a contract for a gym membership. So, the Yakuza membership plummeted from 184,000 in the 1960s to less than 10,000 full members today. The great families, the Yamaguchi Gumi, split into warring factions, not fighting for power, but fighting for scraps.
Hmm. Gravity always wins. Eh? But I mean, speaking of money is always the motivation, which is somewhere along the lines of our previous conversations today. It's of course interesting, but I think I'm lying to myself if I say it's surprising that the real reason that they had a downfall is because Japan couldn't afford their asses no more. You know,
It makes you think,
like
doesn't
yeah,
it?
mm, like ain't that a bitch? It's like I don't know. It's kind of akin to the whole we spoke previously on this show about if Lincoln is quoted as saying that if he could afford to maintain slavery and the nation at the same time that he would, but he couldn't. You know, it's like yeah, it's like yet one of those stark reminders throughout history, like, yeah, human beings ain't really all that great.
Exactly. And as you said before, capitalism is definitely a main religion of most of the world. And when you fuck with the money, then you get cut.
Hmm. Do you think that why do you see it as a form of brilliance to target the civilians and not the gangsters?
I think it's different. The closest thing I could compare it to in America would be the RICO Act, but the RICO Act only targeted the criminals. I think the way they did it was a lot cleaner for them, for their society, because as you said, with them targeting the civilians, it flips the script. In Japan, it's a very tight-knit social community. Your honor really does have more currency than it does in America. And just the being shamed alone, knowing that you're working with criminals would be enough for most people to avoid it. So I think for their society, it was a good move. Would it work here in America? Fuck no, because you know better than I do. Anyone with enough money can do a backdoor deal.
Yeah, true that. I'll say that much. That I guess that adds up. Like I said, them them doing what they did based on financial purposes, it's a stark reminder of what we all know. Really, you can only ask yourself the 10,000 or so members today, what's their motivation? You know what I mean? Like what makes them get out of bed in the morning for this shit at this day and age?
I feel like it's the same way with what gets the old Italian guys out of bed for the mafia. It's you trying to hold on to a bygone era.
I always ask myself that growing up, like, what are the old mob guys doing? Because they were probably at least somewhat more relevant in those days. Like, that's about 20 years ago. Now, like, I don't know. Maybe, I guess at that age, they were in their whole running casinos stage or whatever. But, you know what I mean?
I
Or
feel
hanging
you.
out on the hill type shit.
Right, sitting there eating spaghetti, talking about old times in on the hill in St. Louis there. Yeah.
Yeah, stuff like that. I mean, but yeah, you can only ask yourself that. And truthfully, I suppose that's where we're headed as far as conversation.
Well, here's where it gets interesting, because you do still have those 10,000 Yakuza, but much like how we said with the geisha, they went from being hundreds of thousands to about 1,000. You see that weird transition here, because I'm sure everyone listening now is saying, so the Yakuza is dead? Not exactly. They're mutating. As the traditional families with their codes and office buildings die out, a new, more dangerous form of crime is rising. The police call it Toku-ryu, anonymous and fluid crime groups. These aren't tattooed men in suits. These are kids. They're recruited on Instagram and Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it now for dark part-time jobs. Yami Bato. The ad says high pay, easy work, transporting packages. The kid signs up. He is added to an encrypted signal group. He never meets the boss. He calls the boss Luffy or Kim. He gets instructions. Go to this house, smash the window, beat up the old couple inside, take the cash. It is disorganized crime. It is violent. It is chaotic. And most importantly, it's sloppy. The old Yakuza generally avoided attacking civilians because it brought too much heat. The new Tokiyuru raids, they don't care. Robberies are up, brutal home invasions are up. The Yakuza veterans look at this and say, see, we told you. You got rid of the professionals, and now you have the amateurs. And the remaining old school Yakuza? It is a sad ending. There are reports of Yakuza members in their 70s getting arrested for shoplifting rice and watermelons because they're broke. There was a recent case in 2024 where a high ranking boss was arrested for insurance fraud. He had cut off his own finger in a Yabutsume ritual years ago, but he tried to claim it was a gardening accident to get a health insurance payout. This is how far the noble outlaws have fallen.
Yeah, I'm gonna sort of put the audience onto something because you and I are aware of us discussing that our current state of nation, it's like a South Park episode that's running too long. And with this, it's really like a South Park episode or a parody of some sort about retired gangsters who waited too long or didn't even take up the opportunity to get out the game and who do stuff like get arrested for stealing watermelon because they're broke. But for it actually to be a reality, that's I mean, it's way more sad than it is funny. But damn, you know, and talk about how they always sort of reflect modern gangs in all angles. You have that same sort of element with modern gangs, like the older gangs are more sort of, they're more basically structured or whatever, and the newer gangs, they sort of are more about, it's just not about territory or drug beef or anything like that or money beef. It's more about killings, revenge for that killing, making a song about it, and stuff like that. Possibly that's the whole Chicago drill rap shit that for sure people have heard me talk about. But yeah, that's basically what I get from that. The main shining points, at least.
I think you walked away with exactly what you were supposed to then, man, because as you said, you almost want to laugh until you think about the image and you're like, it's kind of sad. You were this hardcore gangster, you ran the world, and now you're stealing watermelon. And as you said, you start seeing crime change, no matter if it's in Japan, America, wherever you're at, it evolves into this weird mess. And maybe the organized crime really was the lesser of two evils.
I suppose so. Out of this, out of what we discussed last week, kind of, I think we can say the cartel is definitely not the lesser of any evil.
Well, that's fair.
I
That's
guess.
fair. But on a whole, you leave the cartel out. You look at the mafia, you look at the old school gangs in the 80s and stuff in America. You look at the triad. Well, I guess the triad is doing slavery now. So, I don't know. Maybe they're all just evil. Maybe that's what we're supposed to walk away with here.
Mhm. Yeah. Not that I want any beef with your cartel. Wink, wink.
You know,
It's you guys. Uh, I mean, I don't want to say do your thing, but just do
keep
it
me
away
out
from
of
me.
it.
Is all I can
Yes,
ask.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, and it's been so much fun, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm going to go ahead and put the glasses on and hit you with our final thoughts. How do we sum up the Yakuza? For 300 years, they were the shadow of Japan. They were the dark reflection of the samurai spirit. They claimed to be honorable, and sometimes, when they were handing out water after an earthquake or keeping street crime low, they almost fooled us. But at their core, they were parasites. They preyed on the weak, they extorted the strong, and they corrupted the state. The story of the Yakuza is a story about the danger of tolerance. Japan tolerated them for centuries because they were useful, because they broke strikes, because they kept the peace. But when you keep a tiger as a pet, eventually it gets big enough to eat you. Japan finally decided to cage the tiger and it worked. The organization died. But the lesson of the Tokiryu is that crime doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. We killed the wolf, but now we are being eaten by the rats. The structure is gone, the code is gone. Now we just have desperate old men with missing fingers and reckless young kids with apps smashing windows for a quick buck. The empire has fallen, but the crime remains. Take care of yourselves and check your credit card statements. Any final thoughts, Mr. Telberto? Any last thing you'd like to say? Anything you'd like to plug? I'd like to plug one more time. Join us next week when Mr. Telberto takes these reins and leads the show.
Man. Yes, indeed. Crazy story. It is gonna be indeed. Wink, wink. And I don't know if I could do it. This would be the point to where Crazy Story by King Von would stop playing like the music and shit. But who knows? Maybe we'll work that in there. But all bullshit aside, I think you guys are gonna enjoy the road I take you down. It's gonna be nice and cozy. I'll say that much. But above all else, support the fellas. Keep on doing our thing. World's most dangerous podcast. Believe the cheese. Best out. Next up. All that groovy, goofy shit. TOLBERT Simpson. Rock with the guy. It's a party every day. Yeah, out this bitch.